welcome to Co-Opinions. My name's Josh, and today I have Brent on.
Hello.
So we have a couple topics we're going to cover today. The first topic we're going to touch upon is going to be TV and movie adaptations into games.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, Brent, why don't you talk about some things you've been playing and some little news?
I wrapped up Banjo-Kazooie this past week.
Mm-hmm.
Then I moved on to Banjo-Tooie.
Now, you talked about Banjo-Kazooie briefly when we had Alex on.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, you've actually wrapped it up. What is your thoughts on it?
I like it. I mean, most of my complaints are still the same. Nothing really changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I did have that glitch.
That made it so you couldn't get all the jiggies?
Yeah, those two last jiggies I couldn't get. But other than that, I enjoyed it. I mean, it had its flaws, but...
Okay, and you moved on to Banjo-Tooie after that.
One cannot say that Banjo-Tooie is just Banjo-Kazooie with a few... I mean, it is a different game.
Okay, now, is it a different game in a significant enough way that you think that it is a worthy successor?
I mean, yeah. I'm getting used to some of the stuff in it, because I came right from Kazooie thinking it would be, the exact same game, and it wasn't 100% the same game, so...
Alright. What else, though? I thought you told me before the show that there was something else you'd been playing?
Just those two. Just things I want to get to after I'm done, but that's it.
What's the next thing that's in the hopper for you? I feel like it's decently significant.
I think it's going to be Twilight Princess.
Alright. Well, I am up to the Zora Temple in that game, so I know where you're coming from there. What about small news that jumped out at you?
Oh, it is the Sega Game Gear's 26th anniversary.
You are the only person who probably cares, which I'm just saying, man.
Oh no, I know. It was ahead of its time.
It was very ambitious.
Took way too many AA batteries.
Yeah, ate way too many batteries, and this is going to draw ire. I'm saying this because I did not own one, and I knew one person who owned one, and he was on the East Coast.
I owned one.
I know two people that owned one, and I didn't know you till 10 years after they were relevant.
Well, this is true.
Yeah. And he had two games on it, and they were both Sonic games. So...
one of mine was a Sonic game.
How many did you own?
2 games.
There you go. Half of them. But anyways, other small news.
Assassin's Creed not coming out till 2018. At least there won't be one in 2017.
I know there's not going to be one this year, which made news at the time because 2 years ago they had 2, and that was a big deal. Last year they just had 1 because of the snafu with Unity, and there were rumblings and mumblings, and the fact that there's not going to be one come out because the Assassin's Creed movie comes out next year, doesn't it?
It comes out this year.
Does it come out this year?
3 months away, yeah.
Well, I would imagine so because the end of the year is less than 3 months away.
It is a week or so before Christmas.
There you go.
So.
Interesting. And it's also interesting that they've said they don't expect that movie to make a lot of money. It seems to be to increase brand awareness, which I'm not sure who's not aware of Assassin's Creed at this point.
Yeah, I was about to say.
But what other small news?
Honestly, that was it for me. Well, the Gears of War coming out.
Yeah. I'll touch on that myself. So what I've been playing this last week, I've had a bunch of busy time because we moved into the new house. Hopefully it'll be evident from an improved sound recording since basically in an isolated room of the house now. So this is nice. I've only had time to play Ace Attorney 6 Spirit of Justice. And I told you this before the show. It's feeling a little top-heavy. Because I like when a game builds upon the previous games when they introduce new mechanics, etc. But usually when they introduce something, it streamlines something else. So if they give you a new move in Dishonored 2, for example, in the DLC for Dishonored, they didn't just keep Blink, they made Blink better.
Yeah.
So while they're adding mechanics that are adding layers to the game, they're just adding more and more and more layers. So it's feeling real top heavy because I'm 75% of the way through the game and they're still teaching me mechanics of the game. Now, it's not quite the same because I've played every one that's not a spin-off at this point, including one spin-off with Professor Layton, but that was a whole different thing. I should do a topic on Professor Layton with Nick because he's played all those games. And then he needs to play Phoenix Wright. Nick, play the Phoenix Wright games. Anyways, Other than that, I haven't had much time. I mentioned that I was up to the Zora dungeon in Twilight Princess, but I got there 2 weeks ago when you were over last. So, as far as news goes, there's a little under a handful worth of stuff. Gears of War 4 came out. It came out early for the people who pre-ordered it. It's getting good reviews, but it's mostly about the gameplay. The story, they said, it's more like it's setting up a trilogy, and we've talked about this before, where games need to stand on their own. It doesn't need to be, this is a good first part of the trilogy. It needs to be, this is a good game.
Yeah, they need to stand on their own, but if you're going to make more than one, they need to also be able to carry over. Because Gears of War 1 stood by itself. It stood by itself.
The second one didn't really.
A mediocre story. But
mediocre. Replaying it several years later, I'm not sure it was an okay story.
But my point with that one is that while it stood alone, it didn't set up anything. Because the next game either pulled upon stuff that was barely mentioned or...
Yeah, it wasn't. But I'm not 100% sure they thought it was going to be a trilogy at the time. It really didn't seem like it. Whereas this achieved the exact opposite, where it feels like it's going into a new trilogy.
Oh, God knows they didn't set up the answers for it to be a trilogy. Anyways, we've already talked about that.
We've talked about that many times. They also announced that there's going to be a movie's officially in development, is what it is.
Yeah.
And what were your exact words?
I hope this movie explains to us absolutely nothing.
And you are going to be pleasantly surprised with how much nothing I'm sure it'll answer. A big announcement that came from me, because I am all in on this series, Danganronpa was announced to be coming to the PS4 in early 2017. Now this is a big deal, because Danganronpa was originally only available on the Vita, which almost nobody had. I have one, you have one, but it wasn't widely adopted.
Which is unfortunate, because I think it could have been good. They just didn't do a good job with it.
And when there's been interviews now, they've said that they were attempting to appeal to a market that they truly believe is dead. Nintendo, I think, hasn't completely proven the opposite of that, because whenever there's competition, somebody's going to take a hit. But Nintendo's still maintaining strong sales in the handheld market. The Vita, I've always heard, the Vita and the PSP were both handheld games that were meant to appeal to the people who were in the driver's seat. That's how it was described. Handheld games are often for on the go, and the person who's driving the car isn't going to be able to play it.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, both my Vita games are story heavy, not what I would expect out of
most Nintendo.
Yeah.
So, this is a big deal because it recently came to Steam as well, the Danganronpa series 1 and 2. But the fact it's coming to PS4, which means it'll be accessible to console owners, I love this series. In fact, I love it so much that when they announced the limited edition available only on the website, plug, I pre-ordered it. I pre-ordered a game I've already beaten. I pre-ordered 2 games I've already beaten. And you know what? I'm probably going to beat them again because they're super good. Looking forward to it a lot. I really suggest if you don't plan on picking it up on the PS4, look into it on a Vita if you're one of the 5 people who have that, or pick it up on Steam if that is your poison of choice. The last thing I'm going to touch on, VR came out. That's whatever because neither of us really care about VR. At this current juncture, it's $550. It's too rich for the blood right now.
Well, I mean, besides the fact that I'm not into VR to begin with.
Yeah, but you're an old man like that. Anyways, Paper Mario Color Splash came out. This is significant because the last few Paper Mario games have been really disappointing, be it Mario & Luigi Paper Jam, which admittedly I haven't played, but it got mediocre reviews to the point where Dream Team was enough of a disappointment I didn't want to pick up Paper Jam if it was just going to break my heart. And Sticker Star basically entirely abandoned the RPG aspects of Paper Mario, which was a huge bummer because Paper Mario was originally a sequel to Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, which, as you know, is one of my favorite games of all time. So when they basically took it in this adventure direction, but chose to keep the elements of the RPG like random battle, but they took out the leveling up, it was like they want to make it an adventure game, but don't really know how to finish making that jump. Now this game is getting stronger reviews. It says it's got really good writing. The sticker system, which is the battle and inventory and all that, it's handled a lot better. I'm cautiously optimistic. That being said, I still have to finish knocking out Twilight Princess and at the very least Metal Gear Solid 5. So, between those two games, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to it before Christmas, even if I wanted to.
Metal Gear Solid 5 is not a short game.
I did hear, though, and I didn't look into this more, that I am looking forward to a part in Metal Gear Solid 5. I heard there's a mission called The Man Who Sold the World that basically goes upside your head.
Yep.
Okay. I'm actually looking forward to it a lot more now, because the name of the mission really intrigued me.
The way they use music in that game is interesting, too.
That is a very unique way to phrase that. But anyways, once I finish this game, Brent really wants to have a discussion about the Metal Gear / Metal Gear Solid franchise extensively, so expect this to be revisited in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later, but when isn't that the case? We've taken up a lot of time on these sections this time around, so let's go ahead and jump right into Brent.
TV, movie, video game adaptations.
Alright, so where do you want to start with this topic?
So, let's start by saying there are going to be some things that we'll cover, like there are comic book movies, and we'll gloss over them really fast, but I intend to do a comic book video game segment at some point.
Which is supposed to be the end of the trilogy, but Brent,
it may not be.
Yeah, Brent figured out more things he wants to do.
Figured out that anime has a pretty big thing, that there's a lot more games that anime has that I didn't know about.
So. Which I guess doesn't fall under TV to game adaptation.
It does, but we don't have enough time.
Alright, so.
TV, movie, video games, it's a big market seller for a long time. Well, it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God knows that from the N64 generation through PS2, Xbox, there were tons of games.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some for the Atari, the Commodore 64. I think we looked at it. What was there? Raiders of the Lost Ark, the original Empire Strikes Back.
There was also Leatherface. Texas Chainsaw Massacre had a version where you played as Leatherface. And this was interesting because for some reason, given the graphical limitations of the Atari system, you were a neon green character when you were playing as Leatherface. Years later, they released an action figure of the Atari Leatherface.
That's awesome.
He was bright green. It was bizarre.
Awesome.
But you have more notes.
But the biggest one, which was E.T., the extraterrestrial.
That was a notable failure. And Brent, do you want to talk about why it was such a notable failure?
So E.T. comes with the urban legend that it was so bad and sold so few copies, and Atari was so ashamed of it, they took all the cartridges, loaded them on a truck, took them out to the desert, dug a hole, and dumped them. And everyone thought it was, an urban legend until IGN or someone funded some kind of documentary.
They went out to the desert within the last 5 years and made a whole big presentation of trying to find the lost cartridges. And they came through in spades.
They found a pile of them buried in the desert.
And they auctioned them off. And it was actually a really cool thing to go through. But this game was actually like the proto-disappointment. Yeah. Because nowadays, we associate game and TV adaptations, by and large, with a rushed product. A game that's meant to cash in on a flash-in-the-pan popularity. Be it TV, which TV usually maintains its popularity 3 seasons and then only the hardcore people stay. With movies, it's even more so because you have a window of 2 months to really hit that mark? So they really got to run in on these things. And game development nowadays is a much bigger event than it was. So E.T. back in the day, which was a huge movie deal, they really thought that this game was going to be able to capitalize on the success, and the game controls poorly. I can't say it looks bad because it was an Atari game, was it?
Yeah.
It didn't have real high standards back then.
Did not. But then, you can't say that all of them are terrible because there are good ones we talked about, because Disney has to be its own thing here. Disney had good games. We've all played when we were younger. Aladdin, I know everyone.
Even before that, we can go back a little bit before that, only because even on Nintendo... Did you ever play Darkwing? You didn't even have a Nintendo, did you?
I had an NES, but I didn't have Darkwing Duck, no.
There was Darkwing Duck, there was Rescue Rangers 2. There wasn't Jungle Book, but I think there was a Tailspin.
There was a Jungle Book game, but I think it was
on Super Nintendo. Yeah. But I think there might have been a Tailspin game. Yes. You go ahead and talk.
There was a Tailspin game that I did find on there.
Was it on Nintendo?
Yeah. I want to say it was on the NES, but if you're going to look it up. Disney has its own thing, because they've had some good games. We talked, like, some of those weren't bad. We talked about Aladdin. I know tons of people that played the Aladdin, which was a side-scrolling platformer. And it was fun.
It was a side-scrolling platformer that came out on both Super Nintendo and Sega. A lot of people liked it, and a lot of people played it. And this kind of goes back to the whole development time thing, because it was almost certainly faster to put out a 2D side-scrolling action game as opposed to trying to make an open-world 3D involved.
When there's one we're talking about, because Toy Story is another side-scroller platformer that they came out with for the,
I believe,
SNES.
And it also does look like, wow, the Tailspin video game came out for the NES, the Game Boy, the Genesis, the TurboGrafx, and the Game Gear.
Wow.
Right? I would not have guessed it was that many. But anyways, I didn't play it. I just knew that it came out. And I also knew it was the unofficial sequel to Jungle Book. You heard about it, yeah. Anyways, but there were movie and TV adaptations to games other than Disney. I can't speak to whether or not they were quality, because there was a Top Gun game for Nintendo that was garbage.
Yeah.
At least I thought it was garbage. I don't think I ever saw anybody successfully land a plane in that game.
Speaking of that, because they're touted as two of the best. People really like the Super Nintendo Star Wars games, and I think I mentioned this when I talked about Star Wars.
I'm curious who people are.
I've seen a lot of things online. Like, it was when they were getting released on something. Like, maybe it was Steam. I don't know. People were really happy.
Now, here's where things get a little muddy, was because there were a lot of games that came out that were Star Wars around that time. The Star Wars games for the Super Nintendo, I believe, are notorious as some of the most difficult games.
Yes. I mean, they're so weird because they just don't line up with the movie. Like,
in the slightest.
You're killing Jawas in the first level of the original Star Wars for reasons that aren't really explained. You're just murdering people.
Well, and that's like in the second one, The Empire Strikes Back, in the very first level. I've never played this, but I watched them play it on Game Grumps, and it is a insane game, and these guys are intentionally, in at least one of their cases, really bad at video games. So they're just throwing, like, what are the furry things that they cut open?
Oh, tauntauns.
They're throwing tauntauns at you, and they're throwing the weird floaty orb things, and snowballs are coming down, and this is the first level. Like, it's insane. They were in way over their heads.
Past that, when you get to, like, the N64 era, you got a lot of those cartoons from when we were kids that got, television show cartoons. The Rugrats is one that comes to mind because I played several of those when I was younger. There was a golf game. Rugrats golf game. It was based off the episode where they went to the miniature golf course.
It's funny you mention that. I actually remember that episode. They made a whole game based on that?
It wasn't entirely based, but it was a miniature golf game. They just had some elements from that episode in there.
Interesting.
And there was a game, and it was only for the N64, it was a board game. It was like a board, I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, they had a lot of games.
Was it based on Nicktoons?
No, because it was just Rugrats.
Okay.
Just Rugrats. But there were other Nicktoons. Like, Mark told me there was a Real Monsters game that he
That
really
was on
loved.
Super Nintendo, though.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and I think this is more of a constriction of the medium than anything. A lot of those adaptation games were your side-scrolling, jumping-type games. But those games were just really popular then.
Yeah.
What cartoons that we watched, what shows... And I'm sure there were movies, for example, well, this is a bad example because this was also a side-scrolling action game. They adapted the movie Warlock into a video game.
Yeah, there were two Gremlins games for the NES and SNES. I was like, no.
There were
a Gremlins game for the Atari. It was considered lackluster, apparently.
There was also at least one Gremlins game for a system newer than Atari.
Gremlins 2, I think, said it was on the NES as well.
Okay. And everybody knows Gremlins 2 is hands down the superior Gremlins movie. True facts. Anybody who disagrees can just rumble with me.
Yeah, so when you get to when you get to the N64 PS1 era, you get to the point where they just start churning out, especially games for cartoon shows we grew up on, hand over fist.
So what were some examples of those?
Well, the Rugrats one, I know there was a Toy Story 2. No, that was PlayStation 2. cartoon movies, like we were talking about Disney, there was the Bugs Life game for PlayStation.
Now, you had mentioned in a previous episode...
3D platformers.
Right. That you really liked that game.
It was fun. I'm not going to say, oh my god, it's the best game ever, but it was enjoyable, and it was pretty well done. So,
I mean, it goes back to the other thing where it's curious that the type of game that they would choose for that is, again, a platformer. But it's kind of difficult to ethically adapt these into other things like, what are you going to do? Turn a Nicktoon into a first-person shooter? Or turn a Disney movie into a fighting game?
True.
Which I'm not saying didn't exist, because the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had many games.
And Turtles is one I want... we'll gloss over it, because technically it's a comic.
Technically it's a comic, but the only game that I would even consider being based off that comic loosely was the very first game. The very first game, which was on... No, you are an embarrassment.
I played one Turtles game.
The first game was on Nintendo, and the reason I would say I would base that off of the comic is because the cover art for that has all the turtles wearing red bandanas, which is a thing from the comic.
Yep.
And that game was also super bad. That was the game. It was. That was the game with the coral. That was the one with the dam where
water levels are not good.
It's not even that the water levels were just bad. They filled it with pain. Like, I had one person I ever saw beat that level, and it was a babysitter from when I was like 7, and I'm like, I think I love her because I'd never seen it beaten before. I didn't think it could happen. And that game, it was just not great. That game was very mediocre. Now, the second game, which originally came out in arcades, was when they started doing the side-scrolling beat-em-up. The third game was called the Manhattan Project, and that's where the final boss, they finally iterated where you could fight Super Shredder. And then Turtles in Time came out on Super Nintendo. The adaptation of that on Genesis was called the Hyperstone Heist, I believe, which was very similar to Turtles in Time, but actually had less exposition. So I think you just kind of showed up in the past for some reason. I'm not sure they actually explained it.
So one thing I wanted to get into, since we got to the N64 stuff too, was because you had made a comment when we talked about this. You go, well, most of those games were made for children. And I tried to counter the argument that I don't think they were all made, because first one that comes to mind, GoldenEye.
That is a very valid point. I will concede that point, because GoldenEye was arguably the most popular first-person shooter on consoles. I don't want to get any PC Master Race people upset here. On consoles, that was one of the games that made people go, we can play this kind of game on a console? People love it. I just talked to a guy the other day who said he goes back and he plays that game.
It is a fun game.
It's a super fun game.
And every James Bond since then, I mean, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, because I had that. They both got games.
Did Die Another Day get one?
I don't think it did. But I think that's when they started making, like, offshoot 007 games, which, let's face facts, it wasn't a good movie anyways.
You are very against that one, but I'm not going to touch on that. Let's keep moving.
But as you progress, I think that's when you get to this era of just this explosion of all these adaptation TV movie video games.
Mm-hmm.
Tons of stuff. I think we looked at the list. You had a lot of remakes. Like for PlayStation 2, you had The Godfather, Scarface.
Now, those are interesting examples, because The Godfather game, it cast you as one of the rank and file of the Corleone family. I remember I played that game with a friend, and it was really interesting because as a guy who was just in high school who had watched the movie, it really felt like it captured the idea of going into the gang warfare with the old school, and I thought that was really, really interesting. And Scarface took it even further. Do you know the premise behind Scarface?
I do not.
So you know how Scarface ends, right?
Yeah, it's been a while, though.
This isn't a spoiler because it's like a 40-year-old movie at this point. 30? I think it came out in the 80s or 70s?
70s. I want to say 70s.
Okay. At the end of the movie, when he's having a giant shootout with a bunch of Colombians, I believe, who are coming into his house to try to kill him, he gets blown away by some dude with a shotgun in the back, and he dies. In the game, he doesn't die. And he's basically got to make his way back up to the top, which, as everybody knows, is Grand Theft Auto Vice City. So, it straight up is.
Other games, like we were talking about games that weren't child-oriented. Blade 2 had a game. And that was one, And there's an example of what you're talking about because the game did not come out when the movie did. It came out later on that year. It did not do well.
Now, did it not do well, you think, because it did not coincide with the hotspot?
I don't think it was good, but I think not coinciding with the hotspot may have been a detriment too.
Because I'm going to give this one a tenuous connection. When Chronicles of Riddick, what was the second one? It wasn't Escape from Butcher. No, it was just called Chronicles of Riddick. And at the same time, a game called Escape from Butcher Bay came out. Now, Escape from Butcher Bay, I'm looking at this critically, not as my own personal opinion. Escape from Butcher Bay got really strong reviews at the time. That came out on Xbox. Maybe PS2 as well. I think it was just Xbox, though. It came out to really strong reviews, and I really liked it. Chronicles of Riddick came out to pretty mediocre reviews, mostly because it started doing the whole fantasy element thing, and people weren't really digging on that transition. And I can see where they were coming from. But in that case, the quote-unquote adaptation, which it wasn't a direct adaptation.
But it's a Chronicles of Riddick, that game kind of falls into like the Star Wars or the Enter the Matrix thing where they weren't adaptations so much as they're games that go along in the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, like you get to a point in like 2005 where it looked like things go downhill a little bit. Well, you have the rise in mobile gaming, and that's taken a lot because I've seen a lot of movies that get games that are just mobile games because they don't want to produce big games anymore.
It's a quick way to cash in on it, and it's got a huge audience, and they're relatively easy to develop compared with a AAA game that comes out on PS4.
Yeah. Well, and still, like Star Wars style games, there were a ton of other games that we could get into. Disney was one I wanted to get into because Disney always made games. Disney always had games. And when Disney bought Marvel, like the Avengers was the first Marvel movie not to have a game, I think. Yeah, because Captain America had one.
America had a game?
Yeah.
I'll be.
Thor had one. Both Iron Man had one.
Interesting.
And the Incredible Hulk had one. But then they took over. There was an Avengers game that was being produced. It's kind of like The Dark Knight had a game.
I didn't know somebody in the Avengers movie died. Is that too soon? No. Sorry. Go ahead.
They were both those types of movies. Had games that never got produced. So it was interesting. Disney bought them. That didn't happen. And Disney slowly... I mean, you disproved part of it because wasn't it... Big Hero 6 had it? No.
Yeah, Big Hero 6 had something.
Did they have a game? I don't think... No. Wreck-It Ralph had a game.
Wreck-It Ralph had a game.
You proved that I wasn't 100% right on my thesis that Disney just crapped out of making games at a certain point. But they did slow it down and move to mobile games. And the reason that this is important is because Disney made Infinity, because they stopped making so many games, and every property they own had stuff put into Disney Infinity. And that was what they were using, because it did a double fold. They would make stuff for the game, they would make toys, they were selling things. When they bought Star Wars, of course Star Wars got added into 3.0, 2.0?
Star Wars, I believe, was 3.0.
Yeah, 3.0. Marvel was 2.0. And then, of course, earlier this year, the bubble on that burst for reasons no one really understands.
Well, and we have to be specific about that because it wasn't that the bubble necessarily burst on the Toys to Life. Skylanders is still rolling hard. Amiibo, that's a very contentious point. The fire has definitely slowed down, but not so much that they're cashing in on that.
I think they're making more specific ones, and I think they're...
Yeah, until the NX comes out and they come out with Smash version 2. I am convinced that's going to happen.
Anyways, 600... Anyways, regardless. But then, yeah, I mean, 2 months of bad sales and the shareholders call it quits. It's just really weird.
That is your opinion. You do not know for a fact that's how that happened, but... Yeah, I wouldn't really put it past you. I am shocked. I'm looking all these up. There was a Thor video game. There was an Iron Man video game. There was an Iron Man 2
And these are things we'll delve into when we do comics, because you can't you can't talk Batman games without talking Arkham Knight. You can't talk Spider-Man games without talking the movie games. You can't talk those things. There's a lot of back and forth there with certain games that...
So, with the implosion of Disney, there are certainly other games that are being adapted, other movies and TV shows that are being adapted, but have you noticed any kind of significant slowdown?
Yeah, I don't see it as much. I mean, I don't see many commercials or other things, but I haven't seen the same plethora of games you used to have. back in the day.
Now,
bad as that sounds.
What do you think that reason is?
I think mobile gaming has a lot to do with it, personally.
Now, if there was no mobile gaming, do you think that there would be more games, or do you think there would just be no games?
I think there'd be some more, but I think it's slowed down because I think the bubble kind of burst. I think a lot of them just didn't do well.
I cannot find a Captain America video game. You were right on most of those.
I know there was because Baron Zemo is in the game.
Are you thinking of that game you were playing on Facebook?
No. This was an actual Captain America, the first Avenger video game.
I'm going to double check you on this one, but is there anything else you'd like to add on this particular topic? Do you think they're dead? That's what I'm curious about. Dead's a really strong word, but do you think they've basically migrated off of consoles?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm hard-pressed to refute that because while you do still see adaptations, it's an expensive endeavor, and why would you bother trying to build off of the success of something else with another multi-million-dollar investment when you can cash in quick on the flash in the pan with a mobile?
I think my last thought here is, you have certain genres that make you a lot of money, Star Wars, certain other ones, and they're going to continue to have games down the line.
But even forever. The games of the Star Wars variety, like your Battlefront, it didn't really focus on a movie.
Well, Star Wars games generally never really...
Except the ones that explicitly do.
But those are the ones that never do well.
No, we talked about how the Super Nintendo ones, quote unquote.
Those are the exception. Like, there have been actual 3D. Like, there was a Phantom Menace one for the PlayStation. There was an Episode 3 one. None of those did well.
Yeah, well, the Phantom Menace one wasn't very good on a lot of levels.
But, I think it's migrated. I think you'll have some that'll stay the test for a while. But I think for the most part, your kid movies and stuff, they're to mobile gaming.
Well, does that bum you out? I mean, it doesn't really bum me out, if we're being truthful.
Not really, because the games that I'm going to care about there were from my childhood.
I see a Captain America Super Soldier.
That may be it.
I think this is it. It was developed by Sega, came out in 2011.
Yep.
And it was based on the first Avenger. Look at that. Brent, you batted 1,000 on this one. Good for you. Give me a high five, buddy. Yeah. That was the saddest sounding high five. One second. There we go. That's some movie magic right there. Don't you dare pull back the curtain. So you ready to move on to our next topic?
Yeah, let's move on to rentals and demos.
So this topic is going to be heavily nostalgia-inspired.
Yeah, we should have put a nostalgia warning on this episode.
Anyways, so let's go ahead and talk about some of our earliest memories of demos. Because we're going to lump this in with, we're going to count rentals kind of as demos, because depending on how you want to think about it, however enthusiastic you were, a rental could essentially be a demo.
Yeah.
Because you paid $2 to play this game, which, depending on how much you played, if you rented Final Fantasy VI, unless you really knuckled down on it, you were only demoing the game.
So we going with rentals first then? Talk about...
Well, they go hand in hand because when you were to go to... And this is a thing that I can't even fathom nowadays. Where if you were to go to a gas station... They used to have Super Nintendo set up at gas stations. You could
really?
I have played Super Mario World at gas stations. I know I have. And it was awesome because I love Super Mario World. But you started seeing less and less of that kind of demo station. Even at certain rental places, you could see those demos.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that, and while it happened a while ago, it didn't happen as far back as you think. I think at least 2009 was when we saw a decline in those demo stations.
Now, what do you think ties in to the decline of the demo stations?
Well, I think a reworking of a lot of major stores, like Target and Walmart, just ripped them all out. I don't think if they have any left, which I could be wrong. Someone can prove me wrong. I don't usually walk through them that much anymore. And I don't know. I don't know why they removed them.
I'm trying to think because I do remember, because I worked at Walmart for a while, you'll remember.
Yeah.
They did have They did have demo stations. I totally forgot about that.
Well, they had 360 because that's how I played Halo Wars. That's how I demoed Halo Wars, was at a Target. So I know that much. Just talking about that stuff, like... You used to be able to go into tons of places and do demo stations. Like
I remember you could go into Sears.
I was going to bring up Sears.
I played the 3D Pitfall game in Sears because that was I played
Turok for me. Was it Sears?
Turok? They
Turok
put
2.
Turok?
The second one, yeah.
That doesn't seem like a great thing to put on a demo station. That seems like a terrible thing to put on a demo station.
The N64 ones are always weird because the N64 had those demo things, because we're talking about demos, because PlayStation, you got a demo disc when you got your PlayStation.
And we're going to talk more about demo discs, because here's a shout out to Richard Robinson. He enthusiastically was talking about this one because he specifically mentioned the demo discs would have a partner. Do you remember this? Occasionally, I'm positive you remember when you would buy a magazine and it would have a demo disc with it. Now, that demo disc could either come with a series of games or it could come with a big snippet of one game. And they also partnered with other people. His specific example was begging his parents to order pizza from Pizza Hut.
Oh, yeah.
So they would bring the demo disc. Oh, can you even fathom that now?
No. Like, that is... I just remembered that. But like the Nintendo 64, they had those weird demo cartridges, which weren't something you were ever going to buy. You could ever buy anywhere and get it. But they had those ones that they had in the thing that played multiple games. Another place, Dillard's. I don't know if Dillard's...
We're just naming department stores at this point.
Okay, but for me, Dillard's is important because it's how I played a lot of times when I would go. 1080 and Pod Racer, Star Wars Pod Racer. Those were the two they had there, and I played those a lot. That's actually probably why I didn't get them, because I played them so much there.
It's interesting because the places I remember the most were department stores, and when video rental places were still a thing, I remember they were at grocery stores. I played a fair bit. It's funny, the ones I always remember are Super Nintendo with like Super Mario World. There was, I swear to God, there was a grocery store out off Old 50 down in Carlisle. They just had a Super Nintendo demo station in there. Thought it was the weirdest thing, but I love Super Mario World. So that's what I remember. But that was the thing. Do you remember, and this was actually before our time, quote unquote, were there really Nintendo demos out in the wild? I remember Super Nintendo, N64, PlayStation, PlayStation 2.
Because remember, when I was looking at that thing, because I swear, if someone else knows what I'm talking about, there used to be like, they do them for CDs still. And when you're talking about that, because you knew what I was talking about for the CDs, where you press it and it plays songs. There used to be one, for Game Boy games and other things where you press the image and play the preview. I know I'm not insane.
You better hope somebody can back you up on this one, because I got
driving me
nothing.
Insane.
I've noticed.
But when I did, there was a Game Boy one. I don't remember there being Game Boy ones. Like, just a Game Boy. Well, no, now that I take that back. At Walmart, I remember when I was younger, they used to have a Game Boy that was linked up to the,
And even then... Oh my word, it's like I'm pulling back repressed memories here. Because I remember when I was working at Walmart, they had a demo thing for... Oh, I'm remembering all these things now. They had a demo for Game Boy Advance because you could demo a game called Drill Dozer, which I've heard of, I never actually played. But now I remember that we had demo stations for like Guitar Hero set up, and we had demo stations for Call of Duty 2. I'm remembering... so many things. Wow.
Right? Like, it's sad that these things have been taken out. Like,
it is, because I remember you could play... now I'm really getting hit with the nostalgia feels here, because I remember they had a demo station of Luigi's Mansion on GameCube. And what I would do is I could get all the way past the first boss before like the hard timer cut out. And I was so proud of myself because of how far I could get. Wow. And I bet, was there a Pikmin one too?
For me, at Target, they used to have a GameCube one, and that was how I demoed the first Metroid Prime.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember that. And when you were talking about the time thing, I always find it interesting there's different types of demos where they're timed demos where you can get to a certain point and it cuts off, or there are ones that are just straight demo levels.
Yeah, because for Super Mario 64, wasn't it just the very first star in King Bob-omb's Battlefield? Like, you defeated King Bob-omb and that was it. I thought that was the case. Man, this is something else. I can't believe how much of this I forgot.
Well, so one thing I want to, like, we were talking about rentals and stuff. Because for me, my rentals picked up when the N64, because me and Mark were talking about this, we had one of those local store hometown rental things, and that's where we went.
I think everybody did.
So, there, I rented things like, I think I tried Cruisin' USA. I know I rented Bomberman once for the 64. Vigilante 8.
I have literally no idea what you're talking about.
It is yeah, that has to be it. It is a game that is one of those, it wants to be like...
You gotta work with me here, dude.
No, hang on.
Twisted Metal?
Yeah, there we go.
About to say, looking at this, Vigilante 8, fully loaded, fully loco. It's got a picture of a school bus.
Yes.
With, some... Wow. Huh. And it's only rated T for teen.
Yeah, because it didn't have the,
You're
insane, crazy characters that Twisted Metal had. And when I borrow, family friend, they had a PlayStation. When they go out of town, I borrow from them because talking about the demo discs. The demo disc is how I got into Metal Gear Solid. I played Echo, the 3D one, which you guys swore didn't exist until I brought it up. What else? Crash Bandicoot. I played Crash Bandicoot on those. So I would rent some of the games. I rented Metal Gear Solid that way. Me and Aaron, we played the Army Men helicopter games on there.
You guys love those games. Absolutely loved them.
That was how I first tried the second Tony Hawk Pro Skater game, since I didn't have a PlayStation.
And that's truly impressive, because somehow you managed to be terrible at them, all the way up until the most recent re-release. It's amazing. You've been playing them for years. Yeah, buddy. And so, here's a question for you. Do you feel that you bought more games? And this is where it gets a little confusing, because you see things through the lens of childhood, where you remember demoing all these games, and that led to your interest in it. But nowadays, we don't have demos.
So, I actually wanted to make that a part of this. So, one thing about that is, when I was younger, because, you get a limited... I was a kid. I had a limited number of things I could ask for, so I wasn't going to get every game that I wanted to get. Especially when the PlayStation 2 era came out and I had a PS2, I demoed almost every game I would ask for, because that was the thing. I set a precedence that I did not get games that I had not played.
Right.
And I've kept that with movies. I don't buy movies I've never watched. I mean, I've had to lax, like I talked to you about earlier, on the whole demoing thing. There are no demos. There are no rentals. I mean, there are... Yes, you have your GameFly. You have your Redbox, sure, but who...
On your GameFly case, I considered that because I wanted to try out games, but I heard... And GameFly, if you're listening to this, feel free to prove me wrong. I am easily bribed. And I heard that their turnaround time isn't great. I heard they're real prone to breaking discs, which is a thing they actually took up with the United States Postal Service because they believe Netflix got preferential treatment. You actually have family in the Postal Service, so you got to hear about this.
Yeah, they kind of were giving preferential treatment to Netflix,
right?
And they lost it.
They did. GameFly. So GameFly was something I considered. But another thing, Redbox, those rentals are not cheap. And there are still some rental places. I know Family Video is still in existence. But it's not super cheap.
And they're just not everywhere.
They're not everywhere. Their selection is... You can't blame them for being mainstream. But for example, Odin Sphere came out this year. There wasn't going to be Odin Sphere at Family Video. No. So what am I supposed to do there? And... Something that you saw on the last generation of consoles, your 360, your PS3, etc., you would see games that got demos digitally available. Now, part of us might want to say that the reason demos aren't so readily available on the current generation of consoles, for example, I really wanted to demo Doom before it came out because it looked awesome, but I wasn't sure it was really for me. This is a good example because... weeks after it came out, they released a demo for it, which let you play about half of the first level.
Yeah.
And I loved it, so I bought it.
And I watched you play, and I thought it looked a lot of fun. So,
but did you see the size of the demo?
It was huge.
It's an enormous demo, which kind of goes hand in hand with why it's harder to do these things now, because these demos take up gigabytes of your space. So what are you supposed to do? To manufacture a demo disc with demos of that size...
Well, and you haven't had demo discs since... I mean, PlayStation had the demo disc it came with. PlayStation 2 had demo discs you got a demo disc with your PlayStation 2, and then you could send in, because I did, to get some more demo discs. I got a Jak and Daxter demo disc that way. I got that Star Wars game that I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me, where they are big-headed guys on small ships. There were some other ones that I can't remember. I'd have to go looking to see what else I got.
But they still existed back in the PS2 day.
Credit to Mark, he did inform me that Dreamcast had a demo disc that it came with, which I would not know. I didn't own the Dreamcast.
I wouldn't know because I didn't own it till years after the fact.
And I agree. I mean, that would be a really big Blu-ray, but this push for digital, if you're going to have digital, I feel like you need demos. I mean, I know they're big, but are you going to keep it once you buy the game? You're going to delete it. So it's not like it's taking up room, but it's nice.
But this goes back to your whole bandwidth issue.
True.
Because you are adamantly against a digital only for several reasons, and one of them is that if a rural area wants to get these systems, a lot of places, and this is a luxury that we are afforded living in a metropolitan area, we have very good internet compared to people who live in, say, southeast Missouri.
Yeah.
Where if the closest town you consider a big town has 10,000 people in it, you're not going to have good internet. And so if you wanted to download a demo, you could download it without exaggeration about 56 kilobytes. It's not happening.
Yeah. It's a tough one, but there aren't a whole lot of demos.
Anyways. What about Super Bombad Racing? Does that sound right?
There we go. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Google. Well, what impact do you think a decrease in demos has had on people's opinions on what to think about games before?
I mean, I think the one detriment of losing demos, about not having enough demos when you've lost rentals, is that people like to try games. I know I like to try games, and I think it gave a rise to a more adhered to reviewers. And Metacritic took a real rise, I think, when the fall of rentals and everything else happened. And yeah, it could be...
You can't really blame people for that,
no,
truth be told.
I can't, but it kind of sucks that you can't just demo the game yourself.
And something that I'm curious about, and again, this would be more of a Freakonomics correlation than hard, fast numbers, but with the decrease in demos, I'm curious if people's interest in Let's Plays went up significantly.
That would be...
Because not only is that technically a theoretically less biased reviewer, but you're also getting to see the game in action. For example, I know that I found myself way more interested in the game Bloodborne after I listened to the Let's Play by Game Grumps, where they went through the Bloodborne game. I'm like, this looks awesome. And that's what made me decide to play it, because these were people who played games for a living, but they seemed to be relatable, and they didn't seem like they were paid off. Now, here's where the other side is. Game reviewers are incentivized both by their parent company and by the publishers themselves to have biased reviews, and somewhat recently there were a few Let's Players who came under scrutiny because they were also being influenced by publishers. In fact, I think, and I apologize if this comes across as slanderous or negative in any way, but certain publishers had not disclosed the fact they'd monetarily compensated Let's Players. I believe PewDiePie was compensated for Mordor, Shadow of Mordor, Middle-earth.
Which is so weird because the game was actually... I mean, I didn't...
The game was super good. Yeah, I beat it. I got it as a gift, and I thought it was going to be just a run-of-the-mill Assassin's Creed ripoff, which it was, but it was super good. Like, they improved... It actually had stealth. They had really interesting systems. Why they felt it necessary... One of the reasons they probably felt it necessary was the fact that a lot of people did probably not see it as much going in. They thought it was Assassin's Creed with Lord of the Rings flavor, which it kind of was, but it was also a very strong game. So I could see why they wanted to get it out there, but I feel like they didn't need to be as outrageous in how they did these things. Mm-hmm. And this has actually caused backlash in some cases. For example, the game Amnesia Machine for Pigs. By the way, you need to play that game.
Yeah, I do.
You need to. It's October now. You should put that a little higher on your list. Anyways, Frictional Games was the publisher, and the thing was, I believe Frictional gave a early copy of that game to PewDiePie. Somebody gave an early copy of the game to PewDiePie without the developer, who was the Chinese room, being aware. And it really caused the game to get a weird kind of promotional aspect about it, because you've played Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Mm-hmm. You know the kind of scary that game is. Mm-hmm. I've told you before, A Machine for Pigs is different. But when they gave it to PewDiePie, it was really trying to drum up support, was, hey, this is still a scary game, buy it because it's a scary game. It took the wrong approach. And it's an interesting thing. We're moving away from your Metacritic thing. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that?
No, I had a thing about demos, but...
Okay, I'll try to roll back around then. The thing about giving it to Let's Players is Let's Players have a very distinct personality. Actually, shout out to Alex Reeves on this one. He does a really good panel about Let's Plays. And he talks about the different types of Let's Plays there can be. There can be the reaction Let's Plays, like you see with PewDiePie and Markiplier. You can see the informational Let's Plays, like Alex Reeves has, a.k.a. Super Hobbit. Really, really interesting stuff. There's also the Two Guys Sitting on a Couch, which is Best Friends Play, and Game Grumps, which is my Let's Play of choice. And if you were to give a game where you really wanted people to talk about it, you wouldn't really give it to the people who aren't super invested. I know I've seen a couple examples of this where developers, I believe, gave Game Grumps a copy of... what was that game we played on Xbox where we were all roadies? Charlie Murder.
Oh, yeah.
They gave a copy of Charlie Murder to them, and they just didn't care. They played it for like 15 minutes. They're like, what is even going on in this game? That was kind of a weird game.
It was.
But if you wanted somebody to extol the virtues of it, you probably don't give it to people who have trouble beating Super Mario Sunshine. They had a good reason for it, but anyways...
The demo thing I wanted to say really fast.
Let's go loop back around to demos, because I don't think you probably have much to say about Let's Plays.
No.
Didn't think so. Back to demos.
Demo really fast. Demos, they have a plus and a minus to them. Like, you can have good demos. The downside to demos is that when they do them at E3 and stuff, there can be a problem with they just make a demo straight for E3. They spend more time on it than they do on the actual game. So you get this false sense of, oh, the demo's really good, so the game must be good, but they've spent more time on making these things for the people than they do anyone else, and it's just not that.
A example of this, a notable example, and I know there's going to be at least a few people who can corroborate this one, Brutal Legend. Do you remember this? I know at the very least Aaron will remember this, and Kara will also be able to remember this because she actually bought the game. Brutal Legend, the demo... plays like you are a roadie who is dropped into basically an old metal album where you are fighting a dragon on top of a volcano and a tricked out roadster or something. It was almost a decade ago at this point. I don't remember the specifics. Anyways, it came across as a relatively quirky, if generic, 3D brawler type thing, action game. What it actually ended up becoming was an RTS where you transform into a demon and you command your troops to go. Weird. It's super weird because the demo did not indicate in the slightest where this was going. So a misleading demo is one of the most tantamount gaming sins to me.
Well, and that's something I saw with Mark where he's like, well, you still have beta tests. I'm like, the problem with beta tests are people who go into them expecting them to just be demos are going to be sore. Like, I remember Mark was upset with the Battlefront one. Like, it wasn't working for him. And I'm like, you have to remember this is a beta test. It's not...
They're getting bugs out. They're not saying play for free.
Yeah. You're playing for free so they can test for the problems. And I remember going into it and being like, for a game that comes out in a month, this is pretty well along. But I understood it was a beta test.
Yeah, there's going to be glitches. Because that's the point. They're basically having people QA it without having them officially QA it.
But at the same time, a lot of beta tests aren't open to the public. So, I mean, they're becoming more open.
They're becoming more open because with a stronger emphasis on online play, it's very beneficial for them to be able to stress test the servers. So basically, hey, everybody, hit us with your best shot. That's where that's going.
My last thing on that is, and I know people are like, well, there are demos that ruin games, and I've seen good examples. Stanley Parable comes to mind.
Stanley Parable made that game a delight. Did you play the demo?
I did not play the
demo. You need to
demo.
play the demo. Even now, years later, that demo is a treat.
Even RE7, where the demo is a set of other characters that aren't even, it's a prequel to the main game. So it'll be interesting.
You said that ruined it?
No, I said that when people go that playing a demo that's just taking a level out could ruin it. But, I mean, Stanley Parable.
Well, and that's where there was a really inventive idea that Capcom, of all people, came up with about 6 years ago, where Dead Rising 2 had that downloadable $5 hour zero demo.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Case Zero, that was it.
Yeah.
So for $5 you paid for the demo, but it made you level up to level 5. It was basically a 2-hour game you paid $5 for.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
I owned the game on PlayStation, but when I got an Xbox, I bought Case Zero. It was still a fun 5-hour game, so...
Yeah, it was super interesting. It came with achievements for people who wanted that. It gave you a sense of progress. It unlocked something that wasn't crucial when you got the main game. It gave you a costume. Like, it hit a bunch of check marks that were really interesting. In fact, Crackdown 2, arguably the best thing that can be said about that game, was they allowed you to download a demo, which it was really limited in what you could accomplish, but you could unlock achievements and level up your character in the demo, and it would carry over to the main game. So these are really solid ideas.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's technical limitations talking to why we don't see this more often. But I think that developers, especially, I think that this is a place where indie developers could really take the ball and run with it. For example, the Undertale demo, before it became a game, it did basically the whole Ruins level. And I'm going to say this is kind of spoilers. It's spoilers for anybody who hasn't played the game. It's not spoilers for you.
No, I played Undertale.
Right. Because it gave you not only a spoiler of how the game was going to play, it gave you a spoiler of how bad it was going to mess with your head. Because it had the little PDF notebook player guide. And at the end of it, it had Flowey saying, "Go along, we're going to have an adventure." And then when you beat the level and you found out something's up with Flowey, like something real bad's up with Flowey, if you go back into the manual, he's gone. Yeah. So that's the thing, though, is so with Binding of Isaac, you could have done a demo there where it was just the first level. And they may have had a demo. I really don't know. I'm trying to think. Stanley Parable. They ran with that. It was amazing. For example, to give you an idea of the narrative, Gone Home could have basically done just a voiceover type thing.
Yeah.
Where it could have basically been you getting out of the cab and walking to the house.
Yeah.
There's so many places that indie games could go with this, because I don't want the bubble to burst. We've had so many crazy inventive ideas, really interesting things. There are so many different ideas that could be brought to the table to not make demos just demonstrations of just how the game plays, but the very ideas behind the game.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's super beneficial when the game is like a platformer and you play a level, or when it's a fighter and you do some fighting. But we're moving harder and harder toward a lot of games that are trying to communicate more ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a thing for a long time. That's to say, there were Nintendo games that got you in the feel. Super Nintendo games. They existed, even if now they seem real narmy because they're 30 years old. At the time, they really got you. Game Boy games, they all existed. But with the technological limitations coming out nowadays, you're not going to see a big AAA game that's meant to evoke feels. A Last Guardian demo isn't going to give you anything but a demo of the first level. You know that. Yeah. Indies, this is where you can step up. Indies, make demos great again. I'm not sorry for that. But anyways, with that impassioned imploration to indie developers who don't listen to this show, we have hit our time limit. So, Brent, I want to thank you for coming on.
Yep.
As always, don't forget to reach out to us on our socials. And until next time, this is Co-Opinions.